3 True Ghost Stories. Scary Story Number 1. Bite Marks. In May 1951, a strange incident is said to have taken place in the city of Manila in the Philippines. One night, a police officer was on patrol when he came across an 18-year-old girl stumbling through the back streets. She was clothed in a flimsy dress and seemed to be talking to herself. He overheard her saying, "Help me, help me. Someone is biting me." The police officer suspected that she was high on drugs and suffering from hallucinations, so he arrested her and brought her down to the police station. However, when he took off her handcuffs at the station and tried to take her fingerprints, the girl suddenly started screaming, "He's here! He's here! Help me! He's chasing me!" she cried, before collapsing to the floor. As the policeman bent down to help her up, he saw something that horrified him. Right before his very eyes, fresh bite marks began to appear on the girl's shoulders and arms. The wounds were deep and started bleeding. The police officer couldn't believe what he was seeing and immediately contacted the chief of police. His boss was furious about being disturbed in the middle of the night. He got out of bed and came down to the station to see what was wrong. At first, he thought the girl must have made the marks herself, but when he examined her more closely, he realized that the bite marks were in places she couldn't possibly reach. "You can't chew on your own back," he muttered, scratching his head. They decided to keep the girl in the police station overnight and locked her in a cell. During the night, a police officer was tasked of watching over her and making sure she didn't hurt herself while in police custody. As dawn arrived, the girl was sleeping peacefully, so the policeman decided to take a break for a cup of coffee. Just as he was pouring himself a cup, he heard the girl screaming again, "He's back! He's back!" Her cries were blood-curdling and the police officer was so surprised that he dropped his coffee. The cup smashed on the floor and he struggled to find his keys in his pocket. As he listened to the terrifying shrieks coming from the direction of the cells, he was sure that the girl was in fear for her life. By the time the police officer managed to unlock the door to the cells, the screaming had stopped. He found the girl lying on the floor of her cell in a pool of blood. Her throat had been torn out and there were bite marks all over the back of her neck. The police chief arrived at the station with the coroner and both men examined the girl's corpse. Neither of them could explain how she had been murdered while locked in an empty cell. Every policeman in the station was trembling with fear. According to the legend, the police covered up the strange incident and the girl's death was listed as suicide. However, the true details of the case were recorded by the Manila Police in a special, top-secret, classified casebook under the heading, Unsolved Mystery Number 108, The Bite Marks. Scary Story Number 2. Elevator Buttons. When I was a child, my parents lived in an old apartment building that was 14 stories high. Like many buildings, it was built without a 13th floor. It went straight from the 12th floor to the 14th floor. However, the elevator still had a 13th button, even though it didn't work. There were 2 other kids, Terry and June, who were living in the building. We were the same age, we went to the same school and the 3 of us often played together in the evenings. One day, while we were waiting for our parents to come home, we decided to explore the roof of the apartment building. We took the elevator to the 14th floor where we found the door to access the roof. After a while, we grew bored and went back downstairs in the elevator. When we were halfway down, June realized that she had forgotten something. She left her coat on the roof. She hit the stop button, then pressed the button for the 14th floor. Suddenly, the elevator ground to a halt and beeped 3 times. The doors slid open and we realized we were stuck between floors. Terry was about to slide out through the opening when I grabbed him and held him back. It told him it was too dangerous. If the elevator started up again while we were getting out, we could be sliced in half. Instead, I jabbed at the emergency button. The elevator groaned again and the doors slowly slid shut with a clang. "What's going on?" asked Terry. I shook my head and replied, "I don't know." As we stood there shivering, the lights in the elevator suddenly went off and we were plunged into darkness. Then, one of the buttons on the panel lit up. It was the button for the 13th floor. None of us had pressed that button. It simply lit up by itself. It wasn't supposed to be able to light up. There was no 13th floor. To our complete and utter horror, we felt the elevator slowly move upwards. June jabbed the stop button, but it didn't work. We watched as the floors passed by. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There was a sound of scraping metal and the elevator ground to a halt. The doors slid open and we were staring into pitch darkness. All three of us huddled together in the elevator, too petrified to move. Just then, we heard a faint noise in the murky blackness. It made our hair stand on end. Squelch. Squelch. It was a wet and sticky noise. The kind of noise you get when you throw a wet cloth against the wall. Squelch. 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 It sounded like something soggy dragging itself across the floor. As we strained our ears to listen, trembling in fear, the sounds grew faster, gathering pace. Squelch. 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 There was a sickly, moldy smell in the air. It was like the stench of rotting meat. The sounds picked up pace, getting faster and faster. Squelch, 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 squelch. Just when it sounded like it was almost upon us, the elevator suddenly sprang to life. The doors began to close. The stench of death and decay was unbearable. As soon as the elevator doors shut with a clang, something smashed into them with a wet slap. The elevator creaked and began to go down. When the doors finally opened, we found ourselves on the ground floor. My father was standing there. When I saw him, I jumped up and embraced him. I still wonder what would have happened if he hadn't pressed the button to call the elevator at that exact moment. Scary Store Number 3. Pendulum. When I was young, my mother brought me to visit my grandmother at the old farmhouse where she lived. At night, my mother would put me to bed in the upstairs room, while she slept on the couch downstairs. Every night, as I lay awake in the darkness, I would hear an odd scratching noise in the attic. It was very slow and sounded like it was moving back and forth, like a pendulum, back and forth, it would sweep across the ceiling. At first I was scared, but after a while I got used to it and the slow, steady rhythm of the scratching would lull me into an uneasy sleep. A few years later, when my grandmother passed away, my mother and I were cleaning out her house. We were in the attic, moving some old boxes, when I noticed something in the middle of the wooden floor. Under the thick covering of dust that had collected over the years, there were visible scratches in the wood. Chuckling, I called my mother over and told her how, as a child, I often heard a scratching noise coming from the attic when I slept in the room below. My mom's face grew pale and she gently took me by the shoulders. In a trembling voice, she told me that her father had lost his job in the Great Depression and could barely afford to feed his family. He came home one night and hung himself in the attic with a horse bridle. Apparently, at the last moment, he regretted his decision, because he struggled to gain his footing and his flailing boots had scratched the wooden floor where he had hung himself.